Hi everyone, welcome to this new webinar about serverless microservices. I'll be your host today. I'm Grigic and I'm the founder for Livebytes. And with Livebytes, I help other companies with their solutions in terms of digital and technology. In this webinar, you'll be learning how to use serverless, what serverless is, but also how you can use like small kind of frameworks just to make for example, an API or something that is running serverlessly. So let's talk about serverless first. So what is serverless? When you look at the whole kind of way we've been hosting applications and stuff like that, we've always had a server. You've always had something to put your application on. And this whole new rage of serverless is mainly to do with, okay, you deploy your code somewhere, you don't need to think about where it's running, how it's running, installing the servers, etc., etc. So this is kind of where serverless comes in. So when do you use it? When do you start thinking about these kind of things? So what we'll be discussing today is using AWS Lambda. And in this case, I would usually say use this whenever you feel like, okay, this is such a small and isolated thing. We can just run this somewhere else. It doesn't have to be with the main application or something like that. And we don't want to think about it. We don't want to think about someone managing this, someone actually looking at the server. Is everything okay? Do we need to scale and stuff like that? So that's where I think serverless really comes in and really has its own power. But when we look at the way AWS Lambda is set up, we need to think about how applications have evolved over time and how it's evolved also in how we host them. So let's look at AWS Lambda first. So AWS Lambda is, as they call, a function as a service. So we've all heard about the software as a service and stuff like that, but this is like the function as a service. So as everybody knows, applications are built up out of functions, and they all do their own thing in terms of programming and stuff like that. So think about that as the thing that you're looking at. So this is the kind of evolution that you've seen. So in this kind of evolution, you've seen a monolith where everything was in one app, everything was deployed together, and we've actually just have one code base, one app, and that's it. And we just deploy it and it will run. So over time, a lot of people have said like, okay, maybe we need to cut this up in smaller things, especially if you're working in larger teams. You don't want one team having an effect on someone else when they're doing something. So what a lot of people have done is like, okay, let's look at how we can make that into smaller pieces that work together, that are kind of coupled together, but don't really have an effect. So if I change something, it will not damage the other thing that we're working on. So that's where microservices came in. That's kind of been the evolution. Like, okay, let's have this big monolith, and we'll cut it up into smaller pieces where every microservice works on its own, but together they make up one whole of an application. And now we look at an even deeper level, and that's the functions. As I said, those functions make up these kind of microservices or even a monolith. And you can even host those kind of just separately without running anything. And that's where AWS Lambda did really come in, is they need to... you can actually take the function, say, okay, we're going to host it here, and the function cannot run by itself. And there's no way to... there's no kind of managing a server or something like that. So what are kind of the use cases for these kind of things? So if we look at the use cases, some use cases I've used it for example, is say for instance a scheduled job. So everybody knows that when you run on AWS, you get charged by the hour. Usually the resources that you use are then charged to your account, and that's it. So what happens is there's a lot of servers, for example, if you have test servers or staging or something like that, you kind of want to turn those off at night, for example. I'm not using them at night, so why would they run the whole day? That's a kind of cost-saving measure that a lot of companies do. So that's where AWS Lambda can also come in. You can say, okay, I want to set up a function that will actually turn off those servers, or turn them on again in the morning. And you do that in combination with another tool or another service from AWS. That's one thing. So that's kind of a small thing where you can say like, okay, let's use AWS Lambda for that. We're using that in production and it works pretty well. I don't need to think about it. I never look at the code. I only change the code when I, for example, need to change which instances I want to stop or start. Then you have some other things that you can also say, okay, let's have small APIs, like an API for example, for translations or something like that. So an API for translations in this case would be, okay, I call this API, I get all the translations back for my app, and that's it. And that API is actually connecting to my database and giving back me the translations to me. That's kind of an isolated thing that a lot of applications don't really need to have it inside of the application itself. So you can say, let's decouple that, put that somewhere else, and then you can run with it with there. So those are kind of the small kind of APIs that you can run off this. And then there's the integrations. So one thing that I've done a lot is if I needed to couple together two systems. So say, for instance, I have a system which is my CRM, and I have my system which is sending out questionnaires or sending out surveys after something happens in our CRM. So say in the CRM, I close a ticket. I want to be able to send out the survey immediately after that. What will happen is my CRM will actually shoot a webhook. I get that, and I do something with it. And that's something that can run on AWS Lambda as well, where I say like, okay, let's take that webhook, just shoot it to that URL. In this case, what you'll be seeing in the demo as well, that would be a URL from an API gateway, as they call it in AWS. Let's shoot it to there. It will pick it up and send it over to my API. So those are kind of the cool things that you can do with it, and not even think about like, okay, where am I going to host this, right? You don't need to think about it. You don't need to think about, okay, how many resources do I need to have? Do I need to install an OS? These are all kinds of things that you normally would have, and you don't need to have anymore. So those are some of the use cases that you can use it for, but you can use it for all kinds of things. I'll be showing a few of them. Kind of abusing the way Lambda works, because we're actually going to create a microservice with Flask and then deploy it and run it, and you'll see how that works. So why would you do this apart from managing a server? So let's look at the costs for a little bit. So you get charged by the amount of requests you do, the amount of memory you use, and also the speed of a request. So what happens is, if you do 1 million requests and all of them take up 512 megabytes of memory and they take 200 milliseconds per request, that will cost you, if you calculate everything together, that will cost you $1.87 a month. There's not a lot of servers that you can run that cost that amount of money every month. So, and not to mention all the managing cost and stuff like that. So what this also means is that it will actually, when you look at the way you're developing and the way the languages you choose and stuff like that, it affects that as well, because you will look at, okay, can I get my serverless function or my serverless microservice to run faster? Because the faster it runs, the less it costs for me. So that's an interesting kind of catch to have. So you need to really look at like, okay, how can I get this more efficient, right? Maybe I don't need to call that API because that's too slow or whatever, or maybe I need to cache something. So these are all kinds of things that you need to take into account. But when you look at the cost, it has a real cost benefit, because I don't need to manage it, but I also don't need to have a server running all the time. And this is also one example. You're actually getting charged for what you use. So you're not using something, for example, a server can run the whole day, even though nobody's coming to that server, right? So that's also a thing. So say, for instance, you have an app that you may or may not be using frequently. That will also mean that you're getting charged for what the actual resources are in AWS Lambda. So what are some of the other advantages to running this? So the main thing, of course, you don't need to have a lot of maintenance. You don't need to manage a server, update it, update the OS, look at the packages you have, upgrade those packages as well. So you have all these kind of advantages to little to no maintenance, because I'm saying little to no because you still need to be able to deploy the function and stuff like that. So there's a little maintenance, but you don't have nearly as much of the maintenance that you have while running a VPS or a virtual machine. It's almost infinitely scalable, so you don't need to think about, okay, say for instance, I don't know, I get a lot of traffic to my website at one time, and the API that is kind of serving all these kind of things needs to scale up really fast because I'm getting all these requests. You don't need to think about that. You don't need to think about, okay, I have to have 3 servers, otherwise my app will crash and I don't get the things that I want to have from my app. And of course, as I said, the pay-per-usage thing is interesting because you basically can run something like completely free if you're not getting the requests to that particular function or to that microservice. So those are kind of the 3 main advantages that you have. And let's go to the demo because I want to show how this works. If you have any questions in the meantime, just put them in the YouTube chat and I will look at it at the end of the presentation. So we have this API gateway that I mentioned. So what does it do? So it gives you an endpoint. It gives you a URL that you can go to and actually call your functions. It's kind of a gateway to your functions. You can set it up real easily by just proxying through everything to the function, which we're going to do. But you can also, when you look at the AWS API Gateway, you can also set up like specific endpoints for everything, for every function that you have behind it. So if you really want to get to the function level, you can do that. You can create an API, make every kind of endpoint that you want, and then push it every endpoint to their respective functions in this case. We're also going to use AWS S3 for multiple things, but all the kind of code is hosted there. So when I deploy the code that I'm going to show in the demo, it will be hosted on AWS S3 and it will be served by AWS Lambda. I'm also going to use S3 for a later demo, but I'll get to that when we get there. And we're going to use Flask. Flask is a microframework from Python for Python, which will actually make it a lot easier to kind of make these kind of APIs, and you'll see how that works in a sec. And we're going to use Zappa. Zappa is the kind of command line tool that I use to deploy the whole microservice. Actually, what it will do is create the API gateway, create the function in AWS Lambda, and all these kinds of things are handled by Zappa. So you don't need to think about doing something yourself, configuring something yourself. It's all managed in a settings file, which I will show in a second as well. So let us work through the first example. The first example is just a simple hello world. So I want to deploy something that will actually give me back a message, hello world. How do we do that? So let's say this kind of guy here on the left is me. I'm going to do a call, which will be to the API gateway, which will then call the Lambda microservice. So that's the first kind of example that I want to go to. So let's get that. I've set up a really small app, and let's go through a little bit of the kind of folder structure that I have going on here. So it's not a lot. It's just the app.py, which is my Flask microservice. I have my requirements.txt, which will have the requirements that I need for actually running this application and also being able to deploy it. And I have my Zappa settings file. And my Zappa settings file actually has everything that I want to have, and there's a lot of small kind of settings that you can set, and they're all well documented at Zappa's GitHub page. So let's get back to the kind of Flask kind of thing that we are going to use. So the microservice itself. what you'll see is I'll be importing some things like the Bodo3 library, which is the AWS library. I'm importing Flask itself with some modules that they use. I'm going to import the OS. That's actually just the OS package for Python, and I'm going to import the JSON module, which you can see it's something that I use just to maybe load JSON or to dump it or whatever. And then I've already put in my Rekognition client, which is for a later example, and I've put in the S3 client that we'll use to get something from S3 and push it through Rekognition. But that's in the next example. The first route that we're going to use is just /hello, and what /hello will do, it will call this function and will say hello world. So usually what you'll do is you'll look at this and say, okay, I want to run this on my own machine just to see if it works. In this case, I will be exporting the Flask app, and then I will do Flask run minimum host, and I'll do this. So it will run on this machine that I'm running on right now on port 5000. So if I call that, I can take this and I'll go to that machine 5000 and I'll say hello. And you'll get an SSL error because I don't have SSL there. All right, so if you go to HTTP, you will see a greeting, hello world. So this is just running on my own machine, and that's not what we want, of course. We want to have it serverless. So what do I do? Let's get into that for a second. So we're using Zappa to deploy. And what does Zappa do? Zappa, as I said, will create the whole environment for you. So in this case, I'm creating an environment called dev, but you can also create one next to this called prod. So you also have this kind of way of separating the environments that you have. For example, for the first kind of thing, we're doing an app function. This kind of settings file can also be just generated by Zappa. So you do Zappa and then dash init, and then it will actually give you just a small little wizard that you go through, and it will generate the settings file for you. Then what I'll do is the profile name. So the profile name is basically the credentials that it's going to use. The credentials that it's going to use are being set up in your home folder. In the .aws folder, you'll have a credentials file. How to set that up, I'm not going to get into right now, but that's all on Amazon's website, how to actually make that kind of, actually how to make your credentials work and how you can get to actually deploying something. Then we have a project name. This is also something I've typed in serverless microservices, but then it will cut it off because there is a character limit. So you'll get a project name. This will also be used, I think it was in the function itself for the naming and stuff like that. Then the runtime, I'm using Python 3.6. There's a few that are available, but I'm using Python in this case. The S3 bucket. The S3 bucket is kind of a folder that is being used to host the code or actually set in the code. So this is just one that's generated by Zappa itself. Then you have the extra permissions. The extra permissions, this is something that I'm going to use for the next example, but what it will basically what it will basically do for you is when you deploy, it will also say this user can have the Rekognition role as well, because I need to have that for my application to be running. So when you're creating a Zappa user for the deployment and stuff like that, one thing they do is that they have kind of had this requirement that you have to have a user that has all these kind of that has all the necessary roles and the necessary things to be able to give someone a role, or to be able to give the Zappa user that you created the permissions as well. So basically, when you create that Zappa user, it has to have a kind of administrator role, which is not the safest, but you need to have it to be able to work correctly. You can, of course, say, okay, I want to just have this because I'm not going to use this extra role or something like that. But that's how you set up the IAM user in AWS. So that's kind of the settings file. So when I go back, I can actually say, okay, I want to deploy this now. I want to be able to call it and have it run serverless. So what you'll call is actually Zappa deploy dev. And in this case, dev can also be prod, of course, because if you're having a production environment, it can also be prod in this case. But I'm going to use dev because I've set it up as dev. So when you do that, it will actually call the deployment. And what the deployment will do, it will package up your code. It will actually upload your code to the S3 bucket that I mentioned before. It will create a kind of it will create a CloudFormation template for everything. So it will create the API gateway for you. It will create the function, stuff like that. So it will create a whole kind of stack for you just on the fly. And what you'll get at the end is just the URL. So the URL will actually be the URL that we're going to call in our example now. So let's call this URL. All right. That's not the URL. Let's copy this over. All right. So as I said, I've created it as /hello. So I'm going to do the whole URL and then /hello. And it will give me back the hello world that I did when I was running the server on my, or actually when I was running the Flask application on my server. So that's all nice and fine, of course. But how does that look in my console? Because you want to see how that looks like. Let's see. So it will create the function. As I said, it will create it with the name and then in this case the environment. So -dev. Of course, if you had a prod, it will be with -prod. But you get the kind of idea. So when you click on that, you'll see that it already kind of created everything. You can see the permissions. In this case, this is the permissions that I already have. And then it will actually send the logs and stuff like that to CloudWatch. So if you want to debug, because that's also one thing that I want to mention, if you want to debug, you can actually do that pretty quickly. You can just say Zappa till, and what it will do is look at the CloudWatch and you will get all the kind of things. So if I call the API, you will see that popping up. So if you have any problems with your code or you haven't tested it locally or whatever, you can still find it here. You can still find all the logs to your application that you're running. As you can see, it was with the Insomnia client that I was using. So that's my call that I did. All right, so let's get back to the function itself. So the function has been deployed, is running, it's doing everything. Then let's go to the API gateway, because that's the cool part about it, is to see how that has been set up. So when you go to the API gateway, you'll see that I'll have this one, which it also uses the same name, and you'll see that it actually just /proxies everything to my Lambda function. So that also means that when I set up the /hello, it will just be behind the URL that I have. You have all these kind of stages. It will automatically create the dev stage for me. There's also the API keys, which is for authorizing, of course. You can set up API key authentication in Zappa. There's a setting for that. You can find it on their GitHub page, but it will just say API key required is true. So what it will do is say, okay, you need to have an API key, but you still need to create those API keys yourself. So you need to, you actually have the usage plan, but you need to create an API key and couple that with your usage plan to actually do the work. So that's all documented on their page if you want to get into that. So this kind of is the setup. So you have the API gateway, you have the function behind it, and you can actually call it. So what do you do when you want to update the code? So what do you do when you need to, say, add a function or add something else or change one of the things that you already have? So let's look at that. Let's update the hello world method and make it a little bit more interesting. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at /hello, but I'm also looking at /hello and then a placeholder. In this case, it will be my name. And what it will do is see, okay, is there a name? If there is, then return hello and then the name. If there isn't, it will be just hello world again. So if I save this and I want to update it, so what I'll do is Zappa update. You can put in the dev, but you can even do it without if you just have one environment. So let's do Zappa update, and you'll see that it will update the dev stage. It's pretty fast in deploying it as well. And you can think about this in a way where, say for instance, I have this whole thing set up in my GitLab or in GitHub, and I want to have a CI deployment or a CD deployment. I can set that up really easily through this. So I'll just use Zappa to deploy it from my Git repository where I host it, or the kind of deployment thing that I have. So the CD tool or whatever. So let's do this again. And of course I can just use this and it will say hello world. And if I add my name, it will say my name. So that's the kind of way you can update your serverless microservice in this case. So this is really cool because you can really iterate very fast, and you can just say, okay, this is working. I'm just deploying a new code that will run, and you can go on. So that's one of the easiest examples, of course. But if we go further, so let's look into Rekognition a little bit. So Rekognition is what they call an image analysis service, but what it is basically an endpoint that you can just shoot an image to, and it will analyze it. And it will analyze all kinds of things. You can analyze based on what's in the picture. So is there a dog in the picture, or is there a person in the picture? And it will analyze it and it will give you back just the result. You can also do other cool stuff with it, which I'm going to do, is it will actually recognize a celebrity in a picture. So if I upload a picture of a celebrity, it will say, okay, the person in this particular picture is X. So you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. And we're going to take that example, and I'm going to show you how you, when you deploy that, how that looks like. So basically what it will be doing is, again, through the API gateway to Lambda itself. And what it will do is it will look into a particular S3 bucket, which I'm going to have in the code. It will take the last picture that I uploaded there, run it through Rekognition, and actually give back the result in this case. And you're going to see how that works, but it is pretty cool to see how easily that can be set up. So let's have a look at that. So if I take this code, because I've already set that up. All right. Let's look at the code a little bit. So I'm going to create a new endpoint that's called analyze. This other one will still work, so I can still use the hello endpoint, but I want to have another one. I will get the analyze endpoint, which has a bucket. In this case, the well hello there bucket. I didn't know what to call it, so I just called it that. But it will, in that bucket there will actually, the function will look into that bucket and see, okay, this is the last picture. So what I'm doing is I'm calling a list of the objects. If there are no pictures, it will just give me back a no pictures message. If there is images in there, it will put it in an array. It will look at the last modified date, which picture was last modified, of course. It will get the first image that it will find, and that's basically the image that I'm going to use to push through Rekognition. And the way I'm doing this, of course, is when you go back. So this S3 will correspond to the S3 kind of variable that is up here, but you also have the variable recog, which is being used here to do the recognize celebrities, which is just a function that they have. That's a function of their client. So you put in the image is from an S3 bucket. and you will get the newest image name. So that's the way I'm kind of working towards that. And then if it recognizes it, it will say you have just uploaded a picture of the celebrity, or otherwise it will say could not analyze this picture. So let's save this and update. And because I set up the permissions for Zappa in this case, it should have the right permissions. Let me just run it again, because I did save this this particular settings file just to be sure. All right. So this is the way it's being set up. So if I go back, haven't tested this one, but we're going to try. So let's not do that. So let's do the analyze part. Yeah, no picture. So that works because I didn't upload any pictures to that S3 bucket. So let's do that. Let's upload a picture of a celebrity. So let's go to S3. And you can, of course, do this programmatically. Of course, you can have a front end or something like that that's uploading the pictures to the S3. But I'm for the kind of demo purposes, I'm just using the upload in the S3 itself. So let's add a file, and let's do Beyonce, because Beyonce is pretty famous. And let's upload it. So that's it. It's uploaded, and let's call the endpoint again. It will take a little bit, but you will see that it will say you have just uploaded a picture of Beyonce. And now you're going to say you're kind of cheating because the name is called Beyonce. So let's do a little bit something a little bit more difficult. So this guy is a famous singer in the Netherlands. He's called Gordon Hukeroth. And nobody calls him by his last name, so he's called Gordon. Let's leave it at that. He's not the best singer in the whole world. Let's upload him. So let's see how that looks like. So let's upload him and see if Rekognition can actually recognize him. So let's go there, and we're going to send. You'll see. It will actually say that it's Gordon in this case. I've had some weird kind of situations where I uploaded a celebrity that it kind of recognized, but it was kind of a doppelganger kind of thing, that someone was really a lookalike of that particular singer or famous person. So it's not 100% accurate all the time, but for the big kind of stars and stuff like that, it kind of always works. So that's kind of the way that you can play around with all these kind of services. So think about all these kind of services that Amazon is providing. Think about text analysis. Think about all these kind of things that you can use to kind of create a microservice that you can just deploy. It will run, and that's it. And you don't need to think about anything anymore, which is great because coming from a hosting background where you always had to kind of log into the server goes down, something is wrong. You don't have those kind of things anymore. So it's great for these kind of small kind of things that you need to have around. So you need to have some kind of small microservice running somewhere. Great, do it on here, because if it can run separately from your main app, I would definitely go for this, because you as I said, it takes away a lot of hassle. So that was another example of how you can, of course, deploy everything. So say you want to host it yourself, which for some reason people still want to do. But I can imagine if you have like a real big security thing, they don't want to have it on Amazon or whatever, you can still kind of self-host Lambda as well. They have that on openfast.com. If you go there, there's all kinds of documentation how to set that up. I'm not going to go into that right now, but that's a great kind of resource to have to know how that kind of runs, right? So they have, when you set that up, I think they run their kind of code in all kinds of Docker containers and stuff like that. So if you want to have it hosted yourself, you can do that. You can go to openfast.com and have a look. I wouldn't recommend it, but that's just me. It's too much hassle for me to actually host that myself as well. And that kind of concludes the webinar. I'm looking at the questions. I don't see any questions right now, but if there are any questions, go ahead and ask them right now. And of course, you can find me on all these platforms. The first one is my website. The second one is a podcast that I host, so the Bits vs. Byte podcast, where I talk with a lot of interesting people around technology, but also leadership and business. You can link me on LinkedIn if you want to. You can find me there. If you have any questions or regarding the webinar or related to AWS or something in that matter, go to there. Just add me. Follow me on Twitter because I'm posting all these kind of stuff along the way. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube, subscribe now. You can just do that by clicking below the video. And if you have real stuff that you want to like go into detail with, just mail me. It's amer@livebyte.es, so Livebytes in this case. And if there are no questions, I don't see any questions, we'll conclude the webinar there. I would like to thank you for watching, and until next time.